Hello, welcome back to the South America podcast, from the Andes to the Amazon and almost to Antarctica. Today, my guest is Mackenzie Marcinko. So, Mackenzie, you are a PhD candidate at the University of Delaware, correct?
Yes, I'm beginning my dissertation research. Right now, I'm working on Quechua language attitudes. So my goal is really to ultimately compare um, the really just the attitudinal characteristics held by Quechua speakers in Peru, seeing if they're changing at all compared to speakers in the US. Of course, there's tons of work done among the Andes showing that really Quechua is pretty stigmatized. But what we don't know is what's happening when speakers move. Are those stereotypes being maintained or not? So that's kind of my current research program. I do have a past in more just traditional descriptive phonetics. Um, I have worked on Quechua ejectives, just acoustic properties of ejectives. But now I'm kind of transitioning to a more social um, focused research program.
Excellent. That is a great summary of all the stuff we can get into now. Let's start with the basics. What's Quechua? Is it a language? Is it a group of languages? Are these dialects? This is stuff that's kind of bandied about, when you read about Quechua.
Yeah, so to call Quechua a language is sort of not accurate. Really, it can be thought of more as a language family. So the varieties that I work with are spoken in southern Peru. So sort of the prestige variety, as it were, is generally considered to be Cuzco Quechua. But really, other dialects in the area, Apurimac Quechua, Ayacucho Quechua is a little bit different than Cuzco Quechua. But really, they sort of form the Quechua 2 branch. Quechua 1 is more, what's the word I'm looking for? Native to northern Peru, Ecuador, generally not considered to be mutually intelligible with the varieties that I work with. But really, Quechua is not a language, it's mostly a family of languages.
Indeed, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's kind of like saying, I guess, like, oh, these are Romance speakers, and you might mean Spanish or Portuguese or Italian, as standard languages, kind of like that kind of difference, maybe. It's not
Yeah,
a perfect
definitely.
analogy, but
Yeah, and really the extent to which there's regional variation in Quechua is incredible, even just from town to town. I've noticed just so much variation in lexical items and really just the extent to which speakers sort of intersperse Spanish, especially with their Quechua, because of course Spanish is the lingua franca where Quechua is spoken as well.
yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. So you already mentioned Peru, but of course there are other places that Quechuan languages are spoken. And so actually it's quite a widely spoken language with a huge amount of, or yeah, as we said, macro language family with a huge amount of variation from north to south and various regions, as you say, not even just north to south.
Yeah, and to me, I think why I find Quechua so interesting is because it has millions of speakers, but for all practical purposes, is actually quite endangered. What's happening is, people speak Quechua, but they're so hesitant to pass it on to their children because they feel, oh, it's not useful. Um, People who speak Quechua are considered to be uneducated, maybe rural. So they feel that, it's better just to learn Spanish and only focus on Spanish because Quechua is not going to, help you get a job. It's not going to help you through university. So really, intergenerational transmission is pretty poor. And that even matches up with the experiences that I've had with native speakers. They've at least in the US, they've, sort of tried to teach their children Quechua, but it just when they go home to visit family in the Andes, it doesn't stick because really the emphasis is on Spanish.
Right. So that's interesting. So you're saying that, correct me if I'm wrong, with these populations you just mentioned are people who've moved from the Andes to the United States, and then if they preserve any of the sort of home or familial languages, these are well, in theory, they could be Quechua and Spanish, but then actually Spanish is winning out over that because
Right.
it's like, well, we're in the US, of course, you need to learn English, but then if you're going to learn the language of the home, it's going to be Spanish and not Quechua. Is that accurate?
Right. Yeah. And really my dissertation is going to look at that, right? What's happening with these stereotypes that are so common in the Andes? Are they being maintained within speakers in the US?
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. Migration is from every age, of course, but it's certainly something that's
Right.
really in the news these days and is really a point of great interest, right?
Yeah. And what's really interesting is especially why speakers even decide to move in the first place. So in the case of Peru, what seems to be common threads are number one, education. So people move for educational opportunities, to go to university. But what I've also observed is people move really just because of political violence. So back in the 1980s and 1990s, um, many of indigenous communities were basically just decimated by Sendero Luminoso, which was I guess like a terrorist cell,
Mm.
and they just had to flee political violence. So part of my dissertation is going to be exploring, well, why people move, and then seeing if I can find any trends connecting with how they view Quechua stereotypes, if they're maintained or not.
I see. Yeah. Super interesting. And of course, it seems like very, you know, heavy work in some ways when you delve into that, but definitely important
Mhm.
work.
Yeah, and it's been very tricky to basically design quantitative surveys asking sort of sensitive topics in a way that gets at what I want to get at, but also is respectful, right?
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, linguistics has a long history of sort of going into marginalized communities, taking data and leaving. So
Yeah.
I have been trying to not do that. Um, it's tough. It's really tough.
Exactly. Not all the people who did that were, of course, you know, bad people. It's quite
Hmm.
easy to do that, but I
Hmm.
think this is definitely a case of the hard thing to do is indeed the right thing to do.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think um, long term, I would love to do some sort of even just like more of a give back type project. A
Definitely.
lot of speakers have expressed interest in educational materials, so children's books are something that is really commonly requested. Unfortunately, I don't really have the resources now to do something like that. But I think long term, that's something I definitely would like to do. Um, it's it's just very tough because unfortunately the academic system is set up to do your data collection and produce work.
Yeah.
But then what happens to the communities that we collect data from?
Absolutely. And this is such a big discussion these days, and rightfully so. How does one, treat people as more than data points? Of course,
Hmm.
yeah, science deals with data, but we're social scientists. It deals with social things, deals with humans.
And something that I think my program at the University of Delaware does quite well, our field methods classes specifically emphasize how to give back to the communities we work
Hmm.
with. Um, it's difficult because on one hand we're linguists, we're not aid workers, um, so we kind of have to draw some boundaries, but at the
Of
same
course.
time um, it's important to basically just collaborate with the communities that you work with. Not They're not your subjects, right? They're
No.
your
Yeah,
collaborators. um,
absolutely.
I actually so my I had a conference presentation. The paper that I wrote from that presentation, I actually co-authored the speaker that I collected data from. He thought that was an appropriate, uh, I guess, acknowledgement of his effort in the project.
Mm, absolutely. Linguistic labor, as it were. Certainly.
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah, well, it makes total sense. Um, so, yeah, that's all super interesting. Maybe you could give a sketch of how you kind of came to these topics. What got you interested in Quechua as a language family? What got you, interested in South America? This is the South America podcast, after all. Yeah, how did this come about?
Yeah, so my foray into Quechua was actually, I think, pretty unique in the sense that I did not have really any Spanish experience at all before I started graduate school. I was interested in fieldwork, and I was hoping to do research in the field just somewhere in the world.
Hmm.
So I came to graduate school. I was fortunate enough to take a field methods class with a Quechua native speaker, and
Wow.
I sort of realized this was a way that I could do, well-respected research and really sort of do field work on a language that I really had never heard of before,
Hmm.
and sort of just be the Quechua person in my program. So I sort of just latched on to that identity, and I've been fortunate enough to meet some really incredible native speakers who have been so helpful. To sort of just helping me learn more about the language. We've collaborated on several projects. So it was pretty unconventional, my path into Quechua.
Oh, but it sounds fantastic, and well, and you are where you are now, which is great. So yeah, so you mentioned a bit about future plans, but I mean, if you could speculate, post PhD, do you have any plans to continue with Quechua? If so, yeah,
Yeah,
what might be the next step?
I would love to. I have a past with descriptive phonetic work.
Hmm.
Although right now I'm focusing more on sociolinguistics, I really I think returning to phonetics would be awesome. At this point, I don't really want to pigeonhole myself into one particular career path. Of course, staying in academia would be great. It's definitely the clear way to provide you with resources to continue working on sort of a give back projects. If I wanted to make a Quechua children's book, that would be kind of the obvious path. Um, Really, I'm not quite sure yet. In my field, postdocs are not particularly common.
Hmm.
Um,
I see.
yeah, I really quite like teaching as well. So in our department, my funding is connected to teaching, and I really do love teaching. Right now, my assignment is just an intro to linguistics class for undergrads, and I would love to continue that in general.
Fantastic. Sounds like good stuff. If you do phonetics, it struck me, children's book, would there be an appetite for a children's audiobook or something like that as well to complement a children's book?
That's a great idea. So one of my dear friends, Hermani Ojeda, he actually was involved with not a children's book necessarily, but Quechua instructional materials with particular emphasis on dialectal variation.
Oh,
I
wow.
believe the other authors of that book are oh, Carlos Molina Vital and who else? Marilyn Manley and Alana Deloge. But it seems to be just a really good tool for recognizing dialectal variation, which is so crucial in Quechua, and doing an audiobook with speakers of different varieties, I think is a great idea.
Oh, fantastic. Sounds lovely. Do you have any advice for people who maybe also would like to pursue, I don't know, a career studying Quechua or descriptive phonetics or anything else that you've occupied yourself with during your academic career thus far? Um, yeah, what advice would you give to people? How could they start?
Yeah. So I think for me, what has been particularly helpful is finding a good mentor or mentors. So in my case, my advisor has been crucial for me. I'm somebody who likes accountability, and I think it's important to recognize what your style is. So for me, that's somebody who holds me accountable. Some people might prefer a more hands-off mentor. For me, that's definitely not the case. I also recommend finding a mentor outside your field. So in my situation, I have a mentor who has her sociology PhD. And for me, it's been so valuable to talk with her about just data collection and human science research in general. She's not a linguist, but it's great to have somebody who can commiserate with you just about the stresses of grad school. And
Sure.
also, of course, just take time for yourself. I think there's a sense that life stops when you're in graduate school, and that's something I have really tried to push back against. It's great to have hobbies and do something else besides your work. regardless of the field that you pursue.
Yeah, non-field specific advice there.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent, excellent. Well, yeah, I don't know. We've talked about a lot of great things. Do you have anything else that you'd like to share about the work? Are there any places people can find your work, for instance, academic profiles online that we can share in the description, or just any other general messages you'd like to give to the listenership or viewership if they're watching on YouTube?
Yeah, so I recently created a website. It's pretty small at this point. You can share it in the description. Feel free to send me an email if you are a native speaker of a Southern Peruvian Quechua variety and want to chat. Feel free to get in touch. Email is probably the best way to reach me.
Nice, great. Well, on that note, thank you very much for reaching out to me. And it was lovely to chat with you. And it's been an informative chat and definitely an enjoyable one. So I wish you the best of luck with the rest of the PhD project. And
Thank you,
maybe we'll chat again on this platform in future.
for sure.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So that was this episode of the South America podcast, from the Andes to the Amazon and almost to Antarctica. Stay tuned for upcoming guests, and for now, take care. Bye.